Hey guys, welcome to a new video. In this video, we're doing something a little bit different. It's not a rapid game, and I am shockingly not discussing opening theory. We're going to talk about some rook endings. And in general, I want to talk about some rook endings that are maybe slightly less theoretical and slightly more on the practical scale. And by practical and theoretical, I mean practical is something that generally has more pieces on the board, and you're less likely to just win by having something memorized, and it's more like a real game, whereas a theoretical ending is something that's highly simplified and something you maybe see in a textbook, something that is definite and well known. And this first, I think probably I'm going to break it up into two videos. These first two videos are going to cover a specific rook ending, and it's a rook ending that I really like. I enjoy studying it, and I think it's interesting. And that is the ending where one side is a pawn up in a rook ending, and it's a rook pawn, and that rook pawn is on the 7th rank, and the person who is a pawn up has a passive rook. So that sounded stupid and complicated, but essentially what you see on the screen is the most basic version of that. So white is up a pawn. That's the first requirement. It's a rook ending, a single rook ending, so done. And white's rook is the passive rook. So this is the specific ending we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to start with this most highly simplified case, and then we're going to build up to cases where first the pawn is on the 7th rank, but there are pawns on the other side of the board. You could imagine something like this, perhaps. Pawns here, and maybe, black's king is on g7 instead. Okay, so we build up to something like that, and then even slightly more complicated, we'll add e-pawns, for instance. And we'll talk about 4 versus 4, where white has this extra pawn on the 7th, except that his rook is trapped on this dumb a8 square. And then we're going to, probably in the second video, we're going to shift that back and talk about the same type of ending, except where white's pawn is not yet on the 7th rank. That tends to be a significant factor in this ending, whether or not, let's say, the pawn is on a4, a5, or a6 versus a7. So in this first video, we're going to build up from this simple position to a position that's identical except for 4 pawns. And in the next video, we'll talk about what happens if white's pawn is regressed a little bit. So let's start off with this position. And let me start by saying I'm covering this ending because I think it pops up in a lot of games. I think it's a very practical rook ending. Of all of the pawn up rook endings you can get, I think this is one of the most common. And in a lot of ways, it's one of the trickiest because there are a lot of little nuances that can change the evaluation of the position significantly. And I was inspired to, I don't remember if I already said this, but if I didn't, I was inspired to restudy this ending and upload this ending for you guys because I reached this ending in a recent rapid game. So if you haven't seen, I believe it's rapid game number 6 versus CPL Jakob 1905, I believe his handle was. If you haven't seen that game, you can check out that game. We reach positions similar to some of the positions we're going to talk about in a second. But this is the first position. This position sort of unlocks one of the big keys to understanding this rook endgame. It's white to move, and take a second, decide what you think the evaluation is, and decide what you think a principal variation would be based on that evaluation. So if you think white's winning, take a second and find white's winning line, and if you think it's a draw, find white's most challenging move, and then black's defense to that move. Okay. This position specifically is winning for white. And it's winning for a very specific reason. There's only one winning move for white, and that move is rook h8. Congrats if you saw that move. So you understand the first link in the chain of this ending. So white's point is very simple. He's got this passive rook on a8, and the only way he can win, essentially, is to move this rook and promote. The problem is that moving this rook to a square like b8, let's say, simply allows rook a7, and it's a draw. You've lost your pawn, and you've got nothing in return. However, rook h8, rook takes a7, allows a skewer, rook h7. And you can see that the king being on the f7 square very specifically allows this win. And you can see that actually a lot of squares for black's king are automatic wins for white. So imagine if the king's on d5, rook d8 check wins immediately. Because after the king moves, king e6, let's say, a8 would queen, black would have to take it, white would take back, and you'd get a position that looks almost identical to this position, except this pawn and the rook are missing. White's up a rook, and he'll simply mate. And really, any square out towards the center of the board loses to this check. So all of these squares, as ridiculous as some of these squares may seem, lose to a rook check and then promote. And similarly, a lot of other squares along the 7th rank lose to this same skewer tactic. So if the king was here, this move still wins. If the king was here, this move still wins, for instance. And the list goes on. If the king gets too close, of course, it's a draw. Black will simply just play king b7, and when the rook moves, king takes a7 or something like that. So let's go to a very similar position, not quite the same, and I'm not sure what the best way to do this on Lichess is. I don't think I can paste fens in. Yeah, okay, so we're gonna have to import. No, we're gonna have to go to the board editor actually. So let's do that, and let's load a position and take this one to the analysis board. So this position is identical except for the king is on g7. And it's white to move again, and take a second and decide what you think the evaluation is. If white's winning, find white's winning move, and if black is drawing, then, you know, find white's best move, find black's drawing idea, etc. Okay, this position is actually a draw. And the reason is that with the king on g7, the white rook has no real options. So rook h8 no longer works, of course. King takes h8, and the rook guards the a8 square. And similarly, other squares that don't immediately lose the rook, all of these squares, simply rook takes a7, rook takes a7, and there's no tricks. The last thing to make sure of is that white can't walk his king all the way over to get past the 3rd rank, and then walk the king all the way up to b7, protect the pawn, and move the rook somewhere, and then queen the pawn. But something like king f2, and actually this is a good place to stop, and again ask what's black's best move. And this is a very integral part of the ending. I probably should have said this before, but take a second, think of what black's best move is, and then we'll continue. Black's only move, in fact, well, not only move. Black has a lot of moves, actually. If you don't want to move the rook, black's only move is king h7. And this is really the move I wanted you guys to think about. H7 and g7 are actually the only safe squares for black's king in this entire ending. So, again, a move like king f7 would lose to rook h8. These squares are impossible. King f7 loses. And all of the squares on the 6th rank, f6, g6, and h6, all allow a rook check. So this check, or this check. So the only 2 squares for your king are g7 and h7. And so if black does not want to see the 3rd rank, which in general he doesn't really want to, then he can just shuffle back and forth. And the key is that shuffling back and forth, white slowly gets over, and he can attack the rook. The rook can go anywhere along the a file, of course. If you move your rook here, you instantly lose to a rook move because you can't stop a8. So you have to stay on the a file. But that's okay. Again, you can just shift the king until your rook's in trouble. And the key point of this entire ending is that because there are no other pawns on the board anywhere, this king has no shelter. And so once the king gets to b6, threatening to move the rook, now that the a pawn is protected, you can just check the heck out of him. And he can attack your rook, but the moment he attacks your rook, you go back to the a file, and his king is back to the starting line, essentially. Again, he could head over, but yeah, I mean, you just move your king. And look, we've repeated once already. So This ending is a clean draw if black's king is on g7 or h7. Any other square for the black king loses. Okay. So, next position. So we're building up. So we've learned essentially that the drawing method for black is putting the king on h7 or g7 and shuffling back and forth and keeping your rook on the a file. And if the king ever makes it to b6, you just check him until he comes back to some sad square, and then you start over again. We've learned don't go to f7, don't go to f6, don't go to g6, don't go to h6. Okay? Okay, so next position. Very similar, but somewhat different. In this position, white is up 2 pawns. Take a second, decide if white's winning, and if so, what his winning plan is, and decide if black is drawing, and what black's drawing plan is. Okay. This position, shockingly enough, with white up 2 pawns, is also a draw. And the reason is that a g-pawn cannot force black's king away from the g7 or h7 squares. Because black's king actually only needs one of these squares, and the g-pawn is only really capable of making it to g6 and doing nothing else, once the pawn gets to g6, black's king doesn't have to budge from g7 anymore. He or she can just move the rook up and down the a file, and white can't make any progress. Again, if the king gets to b6, even if the pawn's on g6, black continues to check and then moves the rook back. Once white's king's a safe distance away, moves the rook back, and again, this g-pawn doesn't do anything. So there's no actual way to win. So for instance, just g4 if you want to see it, king h7, g5, king g7, and white can actually play g6 here, the point being, of course, that takes allows rook g8 and then a8. So this is kind of the trap, is that the pawn can make it to g6 and black can't capture it, but spoiler alert, black doesn't need to capture it. So for instance, just rook a4, cutting white's king off here, and then, again, black doesn't actually have to do anything. So I can just move this rook back and forth, etc. The only trick you have to watch out for is make sure that when the king hits b6 that your rook is like far away. So you don't want the king to hit b6 with tempi on your rook, and then you have to move the rook, and then he gets to move the rook, and you're probably losing. So when the king gets close to b6, you want to have your rook as far away as humanly possible. King hits b6, you check, and again, sadness ensues when white realizes he can't really get his king to anywhere relevant. You go back. And the same is actually true with an h-pawn. So this position would look exactly the same, of course, except the pawn would be on h6 and the king hides on h7. Again, black's king only really needs one of these squares, despite the fact that 2 of them are actually available at any given time. The pawn hits h6, the king goes on h7, and you just shift the rook back and forth. And again, of course, king b6 checks. Now, next position. It's going to look shockingly similar. I'm going to get really good at this process, too. Isn't this fun, guys? Rook endings. Okay. White to move again. You know the drill. I hope I'm not boring you guys yet. Evaluation and white to move. So if you think white's winning, make a winning move. Okay, and another secret to this ending is revealed. Only only extra G and H pawns draw. Because black's king needs one of these squares, when the pawn hits f6, the game actually ends. So if it's check, black has no real choice but to go to h7, and then the pawn hits f7, and black immediately loses because he can't stop f8. And, of course, if the pawn hits here and black is forced to take it, then rook f8 mates instantly. So if we just take a look at a variation, f4 wins instantly, white has to do nothing else. Black can throw in, like, some checks, but it doesn't much matter. So, like, I'll just play against a computer here. For instance, rook a1, f5, rook a2, king f3. Again, he can check a bunch, but his rook can never even take the pawn, because if he moves his rook, then just like rook b8 wins. So for instance, if check, I can go to d5. If check again, I can go to c6, and he can't take the pawn. And if he goes back now, so here, just king b7. Again, once the king starts coming close to the pawns on the queen side, you can't have your rook close, because you just lose to a rook move now. But, and if it's not clear that you lose to a rook move, the checks don't work anymore, because I can run down your rook, and I'm threatening to queen. And you can't, of course, skewer my king to the rook, because the pawn protects it. So, and you can't take the pawn, of course, because of this. And you can check me a couple times, but I'm going to play a8. So the rook has to go somewhere else, and then f6 wins. If you go to h7, f7, and you can't stop f8. If you go here, of course, the win is spoiled, but you should recognize that the king hits f7. You have to take here, and check takes here. And, of course, if takes, then just rook f8 check. So the win with the f-pawn is highly specific, but easy to do. You just push the f-pawn. Anytime you get a free move, you push the f-pawn, and if he checks you, you just move closer towards the rook. And eventually he'll have to stop checking you and move his rook back somewhere else, and you just continue to push the f-pawn. And you just push it as far as he'll let you. And the win is similar with an e-pawn, a d-pawn, a c-pawn, and of course a b-pawn when they're connected is very, very easy. So any of those moves actually win. Or any of those pawns actually win, rather. So to review so far, single pawn on the 7th with a rook in a passive position is a draw if the king can be on g7 or h7. Any other square of the king loses instantly. It's also a draw if the king is on g7 or h7 if white has an extra g-pawn or h-pawn. However, any other pawn is an easy loss. So, quiz question. White to play in this position. No. Yes, I shut it off before it could suggest a move. Quick draw. Okay. White to move in this position. So his king's cut off. He's got 2 pawns versus 1 on this side. And the same situation we've already seen before. What's the evaluation? What's the move? White to move, of course. Okay. This is actually, again, winning for white. Only one idea is possible, though. h5, of course. So black's king is on the best, one of the best 2 squares, but white can force a passed f-pawn and then of course win the game. So hopefully you saw that this is now hopelessly winning for white. The pawn hits f6 with check, and it's the same as before, except black has a totally irrelevant h-pawn. Kind of a cheap one, but an easy one. Okay. And that's really all you need to know about the highly simplified cases when you're mostly talking about just these pawns and maybe one extra pawn. If it's one of these pawns, you're winning. If it's one of these pawns, it's a draw if black's king can get to one of these squares. And of course, if you can conjure up some trickery to make an e-pawn, an f-pawn or better, really, any of these pawns, even if you have to give up maybe one pawn, usually it's winning. Now let's take a more practical example. In fact, so practical that it's happened in games before. Specifically in a game I just played. And many other games I learned from a chess-based similar endgame search. So this is a position that is modified from my game with CPL Yakup 1905. In my game, this was the exact position, except my pawn was on a6 and my rook was on a7. So I could have very easily forced this position by playing rook a8, black's king moves, a7, black's king moves back, for instance, to g7, and we could have reached this position. So, in this position, what do you think the evaluation is, and what do you think white's move should be? Yeah, this position is actually just a hopeless draw. Essentially, when you're talking about dealing with these other pawn masses, it really depends on how many pawns there are, number one, and number two, whether or not, again, white can create a passer. So in all of these positions with larger pawn masses, it really comes down to whether or not white can force an e-pawn or an f-pawn. So, for instance, in this position with a highly symmetrical pawn structure, where black has played h5, he has pretty much the best pawn setup you can get, actually. We'll talk about this a little bit more in the second video. h7 and g7 are free. So if white does nothing, essentially, black's just going to play king back over and over and over again until you put your king on b6, and then he's going to check you just like we talked about before. And there's no actual real difference. And this no real difference really stems from the lack of e-pawns, actually. So if we add another pawn, things get a little bit more serious. And also if you change the pawn configuration, things get a little bit different as well. So the key to understanding these endings is understanding whether or not you can force either the win of an f-pawn or an e-pawn, or you can force a passed e-pawn or f-pawn, usually. Usually, these endings are 4 versus 4, or 3 versus 3, and sometimes 2 versus 2. So it tends to be the case that white has much more chances in 4 versus 4 and many less chances in 3 versus 3. Because in 3 versus 3, essentially what you're talking about is the only way white is going to win is making an f-pawn. And in this case, it's essentially impossible to do that. There are some exceptions, though, and usually it has to do with black moving his f-pawn. So let's take a look at another example. This is a real game. It is Hochstrasser Papa Swiss Team Championships 2012. And this is on move 56. So it's white's 56th move. Take a second. This is a little bit more practical, of course. You can see this is a real game. Both sides have, pawns on this side. Yeah. So take a second. Think about what you would play here. Okay. In this position, white played h4. And black captured. White took with his king. Pretty sure, yeah. Rook a4 check, king g3. King f6. Now f4. Take a second and decide what you think about this position. This position actually is, I believe, winning for white. I was going to present just this position and ask you what you thought, but then I decided to show the fact that white created this structure on purpose with these moves. So yeah, I believe this is winning, and essentially the reason why is that once the pawn hits a7, black's king will have to retreat from f6 back to one of the safe squares, and because white's king is free to move anywhere, he can eventually put his king on one of these squares and win the f-pawn. And once he wins the f-pawn, the game's over because he just has the f-pawn case. So let's play through this game and see how white did this. It's pretty straightforward, but let's see how white did it. Let me find myself back in the notation. So the game continued king g6, and white played a7. So already, actually, when white plays a7, he has to be sure that this is winning. So, of course, when white played a7, this Michael Hochstrasser guy had the knowledge that the f-pawn wins and that he was going to win the f-pawn already. If not, you probably would not push the pawn to a7. We'll see in general that, a lot of these endings are drawn with the pawn on a7, so you only really push it when you know it's winning. But he went a7, and of course black is forced to go to either h7 or g7. Black picked g7. And white went king f3, rook a3 check, king e2, king h7. So white checks, or black checks rather, confines, I'll get this right eventually, confines white's king to the second rank and then starts moving the king back and forth. And after king h7, king d2, king g7. So white's plan is to run the rook down to allow his king to move. King h7. No, king c2, king h7, king b2. Sorry, I have the notation on a different screen, so I occasionally lose where I'm at like a real professional. Rook a7, king b3, king g7, king b4, king c4 rather, rook a5, king b4, rook a1, king c5. So we see white's king is allowed to approach now. Rook c1, king d6. Yeah, and you can see the problem already is that white is just going to simply march over and take this, and eventually black's rook will have to go back to a1 here, because the f-pawn provides shelter from the rook, checking on f1. This is a really important point. We'll talk about that in a second. So after king d6, black went back with rook a1, king e5, rook e5, king e6. And this is an important position. And you can see actually that black is in zugzwang. So any rook move along this rank, of course this one is terrible and this one is terrible, but any of these three moves, or any of these two moves rather, just take the protection off the a-pawn. So remember, black's rook has to stay on the a-file, essentially, unless it's checking over here, and then I'll have to go back anyway. And any king move, this king move loses to a check, this king move loses to a check. King h7, however, allows king f6. And now black has no good king moves left, and no good rook moves left. Again, any of these moves lose immediately. So rook has to go along the a-file, and then king takes f5. And hopefully by now we know that this is ending. This ending is lost. White will just move his king and then put the pawn on f6, and the game ends. And so this is one of the fundamental ideas about this ending that's important. So in general, white's king doesn't have a place to hide when there are no pawns on the board. But when there are pawns on the board, white's king does have a place to hide. Every pawn provides squares behind the pawn that black can no longer check. So, for instance, with the f-pawns, black loses rook f1 check. And so if any of these squares happen to be relevant for white, then he can run the king all the way over and hide in one of these squares. And sometimes that doesn't matter, sometimes that does matter. In this case, it allowed white to win this f-pawn, and then the f-pawn was completely winning. And this becomes quite a bit more significant if we go back, if there were e-pawns on the board. So maybe if we reload the position from CPL yak up for a second, we'll load this position, and we'll just add e-pawns. Oops, that's not how it works. So if we add e-pawns, for instance, and we go to the analysis board, you'll notice that while black's king shifts back and forth like so, white can play king all the way to b1, then king all the way up, and then notice that, for instance, the e7 square is a possible landing square for white's king. And that might not be relevant, but it might be relevant. So one of the tenets of this ending is that white's king is free to move about the cabin. In a lot of cases that doesn't matter, but in a lot of cases it might allow him to munch on an e-pawn or an f-pawn, for instance. In that case, white was allowed to simply move up the king and take the f-pawn on f5, and it was winning. So I have a couple more with the pawn on a7 that are important, and they illustrate a few more ideas for both sides. The next position is... Oh, I don't have the fen for this one. That's okay, we can import the game. Preparation, Tony. Focus. Okay. So let me find the right position without spoiling it. You'll notice that white is our very own, YouTube's very own John Bartholomew. And in fact, this was one of the endings John and I first covered in one of our first sessions together. And that's actually what really sparked my interest in this ending. And then, of course, I played this game and bungled a slightly more complicated version of this ending, and I was inspired to restudy it. And so here we are. So I'm going to fast forward quite a bit. I will post all of these games, of course, in the description. And so you can already see this ending forming. John scores an extra a-pawn, and we reach a 4 versus 4 structure, very similar to the one we looked at. And John confidently puts the pawn on a7, knowing that it's winning. But, okay, now let me hide the rest, I guess. Let me see. Yeah, let me hide the rest. So, take a second. White's just played a7, and in fact, I'll give you king h7 for free also. Okay. Take a second and think about both sides' plans. So it's white to move. If you think white's winning, find the plan. If you think black's drawing, find the plan. Okay. This ending is winning for white. And in fact, it's actually winning, I think, with 2 different plans. And John's game is a pretty good example of the first winning plan, and there's actually a second winning plan, which maybe we'll show in this game, maybe we'll show in the next game. But, so if you could not figure out that it was winning already, the key to understanding, again, is that white's key to victory in these positions depends on 2 things. His ability to create an f-pawn or an e-pawn that's passed, or, one that I haven't talked about yet, trading into a winning 4 versus 4 pawn ending. So you could imagine if, for instance, we traded these 3 pieces off, but white's king was on f7. That would be winning for white. The f5 pawn is hanging. The only way to defend it would be f5, but the e-pawn would hang, and likely other pawns would hang, because white's king is just far more active than black's. And if you can't figure out how to trade the rooks, that will come in a second. But that plan, as we'll see in a second, the trading rooks plan and going into the winning pawn ending plan is only available if the 7th rank is clear. So in this case, black loses because he's played f6. If this pawn was on f7, this position would likely be a draw. And I think we'll get to take a look at that identical position in a second. Okay, so the game continued. King g1, king g7, king f1, and black played a bunch of checks. Notice that the g2 pawn isn't hanging, of course, because rook b8, like we already talked about, and a8 is unstoppable. So John, again, gets to just march his king all the way up into the danger zone here. Black can stop it for a second, of course. So black sees the writing on the wall and plays rook a6, but it only buys him a second. Again, the rook has to stay on the a file, rather, so king b5 clears it, and then king c6 infiltrates. And now the winning move comes. This is an important idea. If you didn't see this idea, this is one of the fundamental plans when the f-pawn is gone. Rook d8. a8 is forced. Rook takes a7. King takes. And black can't stop white from entering a winning pawn ending. So you could imagine black played king h6, and after king e7, couldn't stop himself from essentially this losing ending. Either the king moves back, takes here, and probably a mop-up operation on the rest of the pawns, and white obviously wins. King f7 instead is very similar. White has various ways to win, I believe. I mean, I think probably g3 wins, probably other moves win. But essentially, white's getting in to this square. So for instance, g5 takes, e5 hangs. Or if the king moves, then king e7 or king e6, and yeah, the game ends. Black is forced to play f5 because any king move hangs the f-pawn. Whoops. Hangs the f-pawn, and f5 hangs the e-pawn. And that would be pretty hopeless for black. For instance, king f8, king f6, this is important, and both of these pawns fall instead. White's 2 pawns up. Okay. That's winning method number 1, and it's an important one. So essentially note that in this specific case, black could even check longer. So we see that the king on c6 facilitates the rook going to d7. So black could try and check more. For instance, king c6, rook c1, king d7, rook d1, except king e6 does the same exact thing. For instance, rook e8, rook a1, and then rook d8. And if takes, then check. Similarly, white could use the e8 square, I believe, as well. Rook a1, rook d8, takes here. And this ending wins. Again, king f7 and just king d6, and I'm going to get into e6 eventually. Okay, so let's look at a very similar ending again. Let's import another game. This is a game between two other heavyweights. This is Boris Spassky versus Eugenio Torre from Hamburg in 1982. And again, I'll post those games. So, shockingly similar, right? And yeah, okay. So it's White's 46th move in this case. Decide what you would play. I'll give you a hint. It's winning for White. But notice that in this specific case, the 7th rank is not clear. So White has to use a different plan. He can put the king on e6, but it doesn't do anything because rook d8 to d7 isn't check anymore. So take a second, think about it. Think about what you do. Okay. So again, remember, if I haven't drilled this into your head already, White is winning by either forcing a winning 4v4 king and pawn ending like we saw in Bartholomew Thaler, or he's winning by creating a passed e and f pawn. And in this specific case, it might look kind of weird. How is White supposed to force a passed e or f pawn in this specific case with such a symmetrical structure? But don't forget that White doesn't necessarily have to force a passed e-pawn right away. He just has to force an e-pawn that he can take. Okay? So the winning plan is actually g3 and f4. And g3, okay, black moves his king, whatever, f4, and black has two options. Either he takes, and after g takes f4, White has 2 pawns here versus black's 1 here, and just e5 will simply win. Making a passed e-pawn, the game ends instantly. The pawn gets to e7, game over. So after g3 and f4, black is more or less sort of forced to leave it. So if he just shifts his king back and forth, let's say, or shifts his rook along the a file, then just simply f takes e5, f takes e5, and we get a situation exactly like the Hochstrasser Papa game where you have these two isolated e-pawns butting up against each other. White walks his king all the way over to b1, then b2, comes all the way over to e6, forces a Zugzwang, forces essentially black's rook to move away from a5 to protect the pawn, takes it, and then he has a passed e-pawn and he wins. So let's import this game and look how Spassky finished it. Yeah, import game, paste here. Excuse me. Okay, again, I'll post these games. You don't have to pay attention to all of this stuff. We'll just skip. You can see very quickly in super fast motion how this endgame forms. And probably actually f6 is losing. So f6 might... I'm not positive about this, but f6 might be the losing move. Black runs into a lot of problems when he moves his f-pawn in this line. And we'll see why in a second. So in this specific case, black has, instead of g7 and h7, black has h7 and g6 because king g6 can no longer be met by rook g8. So sometimes with extra pawns, the g7, h7 thing, you need to be a little bit flexible with it. It could be g7 and g6, or, you know, two different squares. In this case, it could be, it's these two, but you could imagine if, let's say, there was a pawn on f7 and a pawn on g6 instead, it could be king g7 and king f6. Notice the king f6 in this case, rook f8 is in check because there's a pawn on f7. So black usually has two safe squares on the king side where these checks or skewers don't win. So just remember to be flexible with that. G7 and H7 is not a hard rule. It's more of it's a hard rule when no pawns are on the board, but once you add pawns, you need to sort of evaluate each case on a case-by-case basis. Okay. And yeah, now that the rook is off the second rank and the g-pawn is unpinned, Spassky goes for it. So he plays g3, rook a2, king g6, f4. And yeah, black's just losing. White poses him the ultimatum of either taking on these isolated e-pawns or taking on the passed pawns, and black decides to take the isolated e-pawns, but white enacts the plan that we've already seen. King comes to the queen side, forces the rook away. King comes and wins the e5 pawn. This is the Zugzwang. Black has no real choice but to allow the king into e6. And once the king is forced away from the protection of the e-pawn, it's only a matter of time before this rook has to move. The e-pawn falls, and yeah, Torre resigned 3 moves later. Once the e-pawn starts rolling, the game's over. g6 check, king e4, and so on. Black now is forced to go back to g7, but then e7 is winning. Okay. So that is fundamentally how you win. And as you can see, it's usually the case that it's quite a bit easier to win in the 4 versus 4 cases because it's easier for white to create a weakness on f5 or e5 or whatever square. It might be f6 and e6. It's easier for white to create a weak f or e pawn for him to capture, and it's easier to go into winning endgames when there are 4 pawns versus 4 pawns because white's king is sheltered along the e file. If we go back to this structure, again, remember that if these e-pawns weren't here, rook e2 check at some point would be irritating. But because these e-pawns are here, white has some safe squares on e6, e7, and e8. Okay, so last example for this video. Last example for pawns on the 7th rank. Hopefully it's mostly clear at this point. But of course, comment on the video. I would be very happy to answer any questions. Yeah. Here we go. Last one. You'll notice a few slightly different things about this one. So it's white's 51st move. 2 things you notice that you should notice right away. Well, actually, take a second. Think about it. Think about the differences between the 2 games we've looked at previously, the Spassky game and the Bartholomew game, and this game, and decide who's winning or who's drawing and why. Okay. This position, I believe, is winning for white. And it's winning for white for a very specific and kind of humorous reason. So let's take a look at this one. Like I said, it's white's 51st move. Let me track that down. Yeah. Okay. And this is a hard one. I would not find this move myself, and I would not expect anyone to find it, but it's a great illustration of white's chances here. So white played f4. Similar idea to last time, except it also nicely frames the difference between this problem and the other problem, which is that black's king is on the very bad e7 square in this case. So in this specific case, white played f4 and black played king f6. And after f takes e5, you see one major problem with this, that black's king can't take back because of rook e8 check. So after f takes e5, black had to go back to g7, and now he's in the safe zone. Except that in this specific case, white is free to play e6, and after f takes e6, we get a version of the isolated e-pawns that we saw before. So let's take a look at... I'll import the game, and let's take a look at this one really quick. Interesting little tactic. But it's also worth going back a little bit and also checking where black could have done a little bit better. So, okay, in this specific game, bunch of stuff, bunch of exchanges, we reach the position, and white puts his pawn on a7. So again, we'll see in the next video that a7 is not forced, and in a lot of cases, because you leave a square on a7 for the king, it's sometimes if you're trying to win, and you're not sure about whether or not the constellations of pawns on the king side leave you winning or not, sometimes it's better to leave a7 for the king and not push a7. Because if black can retreat to g7 and white can't create an e-pawn or an f-pawn, then pushing the pawn to a7 is just a draw. But in this case, white pushed the pawn to a7, and black's king hovered between some different squares for a second. And in this position, we reach our position. And after f4, e takes f4, f takes e5, king g7, we can see how white formed the same usual structure that wins for him before. So he puts his king on b6, the check forces him to c6, he comes over to e7, as is usual, and black has this check, but he just goes back, and then the rook has to go back to the a file. And I think actually white could just simply play e6 here and be winning, but he plays g3, just a waiting move, king h7, e6, takes e5. And after king g7, king e7, black is either forced to give up the e6 pawn right away with a rook move, or king h7, king f7, or probably king f6. And now this king, just like we saw in the other game, has no square to move to. The rook has to go away from the e6 pawn. I take it, and I push the pawn to e7. As we saw before, it's also very reasonable for white here to just simply play rook e8, most likely. Oh, nope, it's not in this case because rook a6 check. Slick. Yeah, I was going to say just this would probably be just easily winning as well, of course. But there's a check that disrupts this plan, so don't listen to what I'm saying. But it doesn't matter. Yeah, that plan's not necessary. White just pushes the pawn to e7 anyway. But it's also interesting to go back in this game, which is one of the reasons why I selected this game. After f4, what happens if black takes? Yeah, take a second here and think about what you would do if black takes on f4. Or on, yeah, f4. Okay. Not an easy one, but it's a really common theme in these endings, and it's also a direct exploitation of the fact that black's king is on e7. So white's winning move is e5. And the point, if it's not obvious already, which it might not be, is that e6 will win. And if king takes e6, that allows rook e8 check. And if f takes e6, that allows rook h8 when now the 7th rank is clear. Once f takes e6 happens, these skewer tactics work again. So black can throw in some checks or some nasty stuff, but he's hard-pressed to stop just the cheese ball e6 threat. For instance, king b4, rook a1, and I believe e6. If king takes, rook e8, here, takes, probably white's winning. And of course, if e6 and f takes, then this wins. Takes, check, king d6 or king f6, whatever, and then here. It is worth noting that, like, let's say, for instance, I'm not certain, let's say, that black can't make a run for it in this case and draw this ending. This might be a draw. I would have to look at it for longer, but this is certainly white's only winning chance. And perhaps if that doesn't win, that instead of playing e6 immediately, white can walk his king over to a more logical square to defend his kingside pawns, like let's say king c5 here. And like if black checks, for instance, king d4, you know, rook a1, it's possible that now e6, or again, white could go something like king e4, and if check, king f3, whatever, rook a2, now e6, for instance. So if e6 doesn't win right away, the theme will be the same regardless. And the theme is what's important. Sometimes in these endings, you can force through breakthroughs that don't look like they work because of this joined tactic with the skewer and with the deflection away from the normal defensive squares, g7 and h7. So that's worth keeping in mind. The last thing I wanted to say about this game is that black arbitrarily put his king on e7. So this is an important point. Black plays king e7, And it's possible that this is what caused him to lose the game. And instead, he could play king g7, and this specific position and configuration of pawns seems to me at least to be a draw. And the reason being, the first reason is that with the pawn on f7, the Bartholomew trick with king e8 or king e6 or king c6 and then rook d8 to d7 check doesn't work anymore because rook d7 check is not check. And the Spassky-Torre plan, let's say with g3 and f4, black can just take on f4, and after g takes f4, white, because the pawn is not on f6, cannot push e5 and make a passed pawn anymore. e5 doesn't do anything. So for instance, if we just analyze a little bit further, g3, king h7 here, and it's very important that black take, actually, because if f6, then takes, and we get the Spassky-Torre, and the e5 pawn will fall, and this game's over. But if takes, because e5 doesn't hit a pawn on f6 and doesn't threaten e takes f6 or e6, e5 doesn't actually do anything. So rook a6, e5, king g7, for instance, and how does white do anything? Actually, with the king on these squares, nothing wins. With the king on e7, e6 would win again, note. So if, for instance, black was kind of dumb in this case and went something like rook a6 or king g7, king b3, king f6, e5, king e7, wanders out, then e6 might be winning. If king takes, then rook e8 again, etc. Or again, because the king is now trapped on this stupid square and black can't get back in, white can take his time to move his king all the way back to a more logical defensive square and then go e6. So, yeah, I think that's actually everything I wanted to say about this ending. With the pawn specifically on a7. Hopefully this is clear. Again, a few points to remember, just to review. So in the most basic case where there are no pawns on the king side, black must be on the g7 or h7 squares. All other squares for the king lose. Black must keep his rook on the a file. Any rook move off the a file that isn't a check will lose to a rook move and then a8. And then when you move into the more practical cases where there are pawn masses on this side, the key things to understand for white are that you can only win with a passed f-pawn or e-pawn generally, or better, but these pawns are more rare. And the ways to typically create those are either to isolate these e-pawns and then capture the e-pawn by walking your king all the way over and in, for instance, some path like this, or to build up and force him to capture and then create a passed pawn the old-fashioned way. In this specific structure, that's g3 and f4, but in other structures it might be slightly different. The other way for white to win, as we saw in the Bartholomew Thaler game, is to go into a winning king and pawn ending. A lot of times that's only possible if the 7th rank is exposed, because this rook d8 or rook to wherever, followed by the lift to the 7th rank, has to come with check. So after rook takes a7, rook d7 would be check, takes, king takes wherever the king is, and you need to calculate whether or not that pawn ending is winning for white. Usually it is, because black is usually, if the 7th rank is exposed, black usually has some weak pawns on some of these squares, and those are easy to pick off when your king is, let's say, on d7 or e7, and black's king is on g7 or h7. Yeah, that's really all I wanted to say. In the next video, we're going to cover endings where the pawn has not made it to a7 yet. They're a little bit more complex, a little bit more practical, and a little bit harder to evaluate, but I think for that reason specifically, they're also a little bit more interesting. So we'll take a look at those in the next video, and that will mostly round out your understanding of these these distant passed pawns and single rook endings where your rook is passive. And maybe we'll talk about what happens if your pawn is not an A pawn and instead a B pawn or a C pawn or maybe even a D pawn. Okay. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm traveling for the weekend, but early in the week, hopefully, the second video in this series will come out. as well as the last Reddit opening of the week video covering the E6 Sicilians. And hopefully more classical games. I know you guys like seeing me suffer. And that's it. Have a good weekend. Enjoy your Friday. Work hard. And yeah, see you guys later.